Hello, this is Georgina Rose, and welcome to the Postmodern Iconoclast. This podcast discusses the issues with spirituality online in the postmodern era and helps you have a more authentic esoteric spirituality in an age where that is unfortunately all too lost. I'm your host, Georgina Rose. I'm a perennialist and polytheist, and I invite various guests onto the show to discuss topics related to esotericism, mysticism, religion, and everything on the fringe of esoterica. In this episode, we're going to be it's going to be another episode that talks a bit about astrology, but from a very different perspective. We're going to be discussing the Eastern or Vedic perspective on astrology, how that varies from Western astrology, and what that tradition sort of teaches and explores. So I think this will be a really, really exciting conversation. I have an awesome guest on. Can you say a little bit about yourself?
Shreem Namaha. So before I say anything about myself, I like to do a little prayer and then I'll talk. Okay. Om Gam Gurubhyo Namaha. Om Gam Ganpate Namaha. Vagdeve cha vidmahe virinchi patni dhemahi. Tanno Vani prachodayat. Shukapriyaya vidmahe kameshwaraya dhemahi. Tanno Shyama prachodayat. Shri Parameshwari Arpanamastu. Shrimatre Namaha. So, my name is Siddhi, and I have been studying astrology mainly since I was 15. It's been about 10 to 12 years now. So, I've been doing Vedic astrology for the past 4 or 5 years. And I'm a Devi Upasak. That's like my number one identity, is that I love the feminine divine. So, that's basically my short introduction.
Awesome. I love that. And I thought that prayer was just so beautiful. I really appreciate that you included that. So I guess to start, I should ask the most basic question, right? For the people who know literally nothing. What is Vedic astrology?
Okay, so as we already know, astrology is like the study of celestial bodies, okay? But Vedic astrology is sort of like, so Vedic astrology is known as Jyotisha, which means the study of light. The two luminaries that we have in the sky, sun and moon, are actually known to be the earrings of the goddess that we worship, who's the creator of the universe. And so, because she wears the sun and moon as her earrings, as her ornaments, she's the one who controls time. And so, that is what we're trying to sort of study and understand and how it impacts our life. So that's basically what Jyotish is. It's a Vedanga, which means it's one of the sort of parts of the Vedas. Vedas are basically these sort of collection of, I wouldn't like to say rules, but sort of an sort of a guideline of how to live life that were created by seers in the ancient time. So Jyotish is one of them, and it started off as astronomy. So that's what people tried to understand: what are these celestial bodies, and then it slowly evolved into astrology, which is how these celestial bodies affect us. So that's what Vedic astrology basically is. And the study differs only very slightly from tropical astrology because there's like a deification of, all of these celestial bodies. They're not just rocks in the sky or anything like that. When you look at a particular planet, that's because it's a part of Devi herself. That particular part is very important. That's why we worship certain planets, to remediate them in a way. So, for example, there's like a lot of fear mongering about negative planets or cruel planets like Mars, Saturn, and so we have sort of deities that are related to these planets, and we worship the planet themselves so that they're able to bestow grace upon us. So I think that's one sort of major difference between Vedic and tropical astrology, is where you get to see these planets as actual deities.
That's really interesting. So is each individual planet like a deity? Because you mentioned that they're part of one kind of it sounded like they're part of like one larger deity. So how does that kind of work?
So, in the deity system in Hinduism, suppose you have you have your whole body, right? And you have all of these different parts that have particular functions. For example, your hands do a certain kind of work for you, your legs make you walk, your mouth is able to speak and do all of those things. It is all, it is, you've heard of gestalt psychology before.
Yes.
It's basically the whole that the sum of the whole is bigger than the sum of its parts, right? Or something like that. That's what they say. I've been so out of psychology for so long. But it talks about like a holistic perspective. So if we look at each planet, so we have this main deity which is known as Kala Purusha, which means the man of time. Now, this can be a man, this can be a woman, this can be the goddess, depending on whatever sort of inclination you have. For example, if you are a worshipper of the divine feminine, you will see that each of these planets are adorning her as different parts of her body or like jewelry. If you see the divine as the divine masculine, which is Vishnu, is one of the major deities that is related to Kalapurusha, you'll see the zodiac signs being different parts of his bodies, these planets being revolving around him, all of those things. So it depends. But these sub deities all have their specific function, and they get their sort of energy from the main one, who's beyond comprehension, beyond anything that we can define. So the goddess basically limits herself into these particular functions just to play around and have fun.
That makes a lot of sense. And you mentioned remediation. Remediation is an idea that I'm very interested in. And the way I see it done in like Western planetary systems is basically like you kind of do actions that relate to each planet. So in a Vedic perspective, you would instead like worship the planet. Is that what I'm getting?
So that is one part. I'm actually very into the idea of doing actions because they're more effective than sort of just worshipping the planet and then you go ahead in your day to day life and you're just so for example, a lot of people want to remediate Shani, which is Saturn, and so they wear like a sapphire and they'll do all of these pujas and rituals and all of those things. They help to an extent, but if you're not able to truly imbibe those values of Saturn, for example, respecting people from like the lower rungs of society, standing up for people who are underprivileged, also allowing yourself to rest, because Shani is the lord of rest. He's the Ayush Karka, the lord of the one that gives you a longer life. So if you're not able to imbibe these values, all of this remediation that you're spending money on is quite useless, in my opinion. So it's important to know why you're doing remediation in the first place. Some of us start doing remediation, especially in Vedic astrology, because doing rituals and all of these things can seem very attractive and juicy and all of those things. So people get attracted to that, but they don't really understand that the ritual should be happening on the inside and not externally.
Yeah, I see that problem a lot with people where they are doing rituals, but they're not, they're not doing that inner work. They're just doing the rituals because the rituals are cool. And I think without considering like philosophy and all the things that come with it, a lot of the rituals are going to fall flat if you're not really like devoting yourself to what it means and what it embodies.
Yeah, which is why we have like a concept of antaryaga. So a yaga is basically a fire ritual you do on the external side where you offer certain things to the fire. So the fire is like the main messenger who takes all of your desires and all of your wishes to the divine. And so when you offer up things and you sacrifice things to this particular fire, you're kind of giving it all up and asking God to nourish you in certain ways. You can do that externally. You at to a certain extent, you will reach somewhere in life. You'll have whatever you asked for, and that's a very limited thing. But when you do an internal ritual, which is antaryaga, which means a fire ritual on the inside, what are you giving up? You have to really sort of give up all of your self concepts that you've held on for so long. You have to give up a lot of these things, these attachments you have with things around you. You have to give up your idea of who you are essentially in order to expand. So that's what an antaryaga is.
That makes a lot of sense. I think that's really beautiful because I do find people go into this stuff wanting to be transformed, and often they struggle to actually release what needs to be transformed, because in order to transform, you inherently have to give things up. So, is giving things up like a big part of this process?
So yes and no. So the goddess when we worship goddess, the goddess in uh, in our tradition, which is Shividya, or in the Hindu tradition generally, she's the giver of bhoga and moksha. Bhoga means she's the one who's going to feed you, she's going to nourish you, and she's also the one that's going to liberate you. It's only through her grace everything happens. And so when you give up things, you don't give them up with the intention, oh, she's going to give. That's like, that becomes a sort of transactional relationship. You give up those things only because you want to become like her and nothing else. So let's say you have this certain concept, and some of these things you have to give up are actually negative concepts you have about yourself that are really, really hard to get rid of. For example, if someone has this concept in their mind that, I'm a victim, and we all believe that to some extent, that everything is happening to us, everything is being done to us. And so when people hold on so strongly to that concept, it sort of becomes like a barrier in their spiritual progress.
Yes, I've seen that in so many people, right? They get trapped in their own mind, right? They're trapped by themselves. And I feel like any truly transformative and powerful spiritual experience is going to make you change and make you release things. And I think even though everyone can say, well, I don't want to see myself as a victim, that's not where I believe myself to be. I think a lot of people do internalize that. And I think that's a
Mhm.
really beautiful way to see it, because when you are, I guess, in a sense, giving something up, it's typically for your better, is what I'm getting the sense of.
Yeah, but in the long, it is for your better. But you also, like, the whole point of tantra, which is what path that I'm particularly taking. Tantra is about sort of expansion of your idea of who you are. My idea of who I am right now is probably, I'm just a Vedic astrologer, I'm only doing these things in my life, I'm just someone's daughter. My idea hasn't expanded to a point where I'm thinking I am Devi or I am Shiva or anything like that. It's just an example I'm giving. My perspective is different, and a lot of people think it's egoistic, but it actually comes from a place of sort of just having that experience, which comes from really, really strong penance that you have to do with any spiritual path. It's going to really, wring you out like a wet cloth.
Yeah, I can totally see that. Um, so with expansion, you basically have to like release things in order to expand. I guess release the things that are holding you back from expansion.
Yes, but particularly that. So, and also expansion does not really mean you become larger than your ego or whatever like that. Expansion actually helps you become more playful in life because you don't take anything too seriously, and nothing touches you. That's what God is, right? When you look at the divine, when you experience the divine, you will know for sure that nothing affects the divine. It's like being of the world but not really touched by it. And so that's what humans have, this problem where we become so engrossed in our stories, in our worlds. My teacher, Kavita Ma, she says this quite often. So having a living teacher for these things is really important because you have like a living example of what the divine is. And she talks a lot about me stories, which means we get stuck in this concept of who we are and what we want to be, and don't really go beyond that limited sort of knowledge.
Yeah. Would you say that if someone was to look into Vedic astrology on like a deeper level and experience ideas like remediation, they would need a teacher? Is it a system where like teachers are very, very important?
So, yes and no. I feel like what happens in a lot of student teacher circles these days, again, everything in this world is your teacher, regardless. So, if you are supposed to get, it's all a karmic thing. If you are to get a teacher in this life, you will get them. If you are not to have that particular karma, you're not just going to have a teacher. For me, I don't have a Vedic astrology teacher at all. Everything was done by myself. I studied by myself, even though I come from a family of Jyotishis, but none of them wanted to teach women. So they thought like, oh, she has a silly hobby, and so we're gonna let her pursue this. Um, but I deeply fell in love with Jyotish because of my ability to sort of open up these books and just pour hours into studying these things. So if people want to learn, I think it's an impulse. You need to have that fire to pursue anything like that, whether you have a teacher or not. Doesn't matter.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You mentioned karma a few times. What role does karma play in Jyotish?
So karma is actually very misunderstood. What people think of karma is, all of these songs that talk about karma being a bitch or whatever. um, Most oftentimes, karma is misunderstood as this like ATM. So you go to the bank, you have a transaction, you get a certain result, and then you spend that. Karma is plain and simple action. You do something and you bear the consequences for it. A person who attaches too much of themselves to the kind of karma they're doing, whether it's good karma or bad karma. Good karma could be like, I am doing charity, I'm doing this and that. You attach too much to that, you're going to gain some merit, which is also karma. When you get some merit in your life, which is why fifth house in Vedic astrology is known as Punya, which means the merits from your past life. And that is also something you have to let go of. You're not supposed to be attached to the idea of being a good person.
That's really interesting. You mentioned past life influencing your astrology, and that gets brought up occasionally, very, very rarely, but occasionally in Western astrology with the idea of like the South Node. Does the idea of past lives play a much bigger role in Vedic astrology?
To an extent, again, past lives are not verifiable, but you can look at certain planets in the chart. For example, Ketu, which is the south node, it shows you where what you've mastered in your past life. So and then we have certain positions of Ketu doing really well in life, and then each planet has its Marna Karkasthana, which means a death point for that planet. And so that death point of a planet is actually a liberation of the cycles from that particular planet. And so, if you have Ketu in the fourth house, which is South Node in the fourth house, a lot of people sort of eventually, fourth house is what? Our family, our attachments to our childhood, just like our attachment to the mother even relates to the fourth house. Just having a sort of, identity that you're strongly pulled towards. That's what fourth house is. And so, when you have the death, so Ketu, that is what you've mastered and once you master like the fourth house, it's like one of the biggest blessings in the world. So once you've mastered that particular point or that particular area in your chart, wherever Ketu is sitting, you get rewarded in some way by that desire of the north node or Rahu. And so we can see certain sort of planets affecting certain houses for this season. And so, like going back to the South Node, when you have mastered that sort of detachment, because again, South Node is about what you've mastered, so you're not too attached to it in this life. And the fourth house is also the death point of the South Node. And so it shows that you've mastered sort of detachment from the thing that actually keeps you down to earth, which is your mom and your attachment to your family and all of those things. And so it's actually a wonderful placement to have in the chart, even though it gives you a lot of pain in life, but it makes you very empathetic to people who suffer a lot. Sorry, I went on about Keith.
No, that was really interesting. I've heard a lot of people say Rahu and Ketu, or the North Node and the South Node, are very malefic. What are your thoughts on that idea?
I think, yeah, sure, they can be malefic. I feel like people have this sort of issue with like fear mongering when it comes to cruel planets. Life is not always going to be roses. You have to have some thorns in order to protect those roses. So if people expect everything to just be nice and juicy, because if you look at let's say the planet Jupiter, it's related to fat. Okay, Saturn is the planet that is related to being able to fast, being able to be slim. You have an excess of either of those things, is just going to make you diseased in some way, right? So there needs to be a balance. And similarly, with Rahu and Ketu being so demonized, because they're supposed to, maybe they're supposed to be anxious, they're supposed to cause detachment, all of those things. These are things we're not supposed to be scared of. Like I said, when you expand that idea of who you are, you're not scared of these things anymore. You're kind of playful. You think of whatever problem that comes your way as like an opportunity to have that expansion, have that sort of experience of going beyond it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I've noticed as I've sort of gone throughout life and had experience with the cruel planets, as you're putting it,
Mhm.
they have often made me better, but it has certainly been a trial through fire. And I guess learning to trust that process would be an important lesson.
But see, that's why you're so intelligent and you're so balanced in your approach with life. Because I've been following you way before I got into Vedic astrology or anything like that, and it's such a beautiful perspective to have. Everything that you've talked about, everything you talk about on your YouTube, Patreon, all of those things, they're so inspiring. It's like it shows someone puts themselves through that penance that is required for reaching a certain point of spiritual mastery.
Thank you so much. That's so insanely kind. I try my best. I try my best.
We're all trying our best. I feel like people, put too much pressure on themselves. Also, because social media can be so cruel sometimes. Um, but we're all just trying our best in this world. Even people who are, supposed to be like really privileged, they're all just suffering. Everyone is just going through some extent of suffering, and we're all trying to find release through it.
Yeah, I don't think that anyone is spared from these like negative metaphysical experiences. And I mean, I don't know your perspective on this, but I truly do believe like everything does happen for a reason. Um, so I mean,
Yeah,
I think we're going through it for a reason, and often
yeah,
these
yeah.
things are. So one thing I did want to ask you about is so when you look at and like if you put in online, like go online and put in your birth data into a like natal chart website for tropical versus Vedic astrology, like the chart shape looks
Mhm.
very different. Like I've noticed the ones that they compute you to. So
Yeah.
what is with the shape thing of like the charts? Do you get what I'm saying?
Yeah, I get it. And this is one of the first sort of things we were taught, or like we learn. So we actually have many different ways of interpreting the chart. There is the sort of, so they're divided mainly into two. These are the main ones that are being used. So there's a North Indian style of chart, which is shaped like a diamond. So for Venusian astrologers, for people who have like a strong Venus inclination, they sort of move towards that kind of chart. And the other kind of chart is known as a lotus chart, which is related to Jupiter. So people who have like a stronger Jupiter, because Venus and Jupiter are equally important in the field of astrology. So people who have like a stronger Jupiter, they Jupiterians generally tend to move towards sort of the lotus charts. And the charts that we use in tropical astrology, the circle charts are actually known as solar charts because they're shaped like the sun. And so I know one of my closest friends, she uses those circle charts because she's been a tropical astrologer for so long, and then she made a switch to Jyotish, but she couldn't really get into the whole aspect of a diamond chart or a lotus chart. So she stuck to using the circle charts. And AstroSeek, I think, has that quality where you get the circle chart instead of the diamond or lotus.
Okay, so it's not like there's a strong it's just kind of like how you desire to read which one you use. Is that how you would like
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
that makes sense.
for example,
'Cause
I have like a very strong Venus in my chart, and so I've naturally, even though one of these courses I joined, the teacher was very strict about the kind of chart they wanted you to read, but I could not compute in my mind that particular type of lotus chart. It just wouldn't happen. I was still attracted to this diamond chart thing.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. Because I've definitely looked at the different chart and been like, "Oh my God, what is that?" Like I've looked at it, and it's so foreign from like my way of perceiving like astrological charts. that I honestly like I'm lost when I look at them. I'm like, whoa, that's crazy looking. So it's nice to know that it's more like kind of your inclinations. I mean, that makes complete sense.
Yeah, I feel like generally with spirituality, astrology, whatever it is, you do whatever you feel most attracted to instead of trying to force yourself into a mold and, just following what other people are saying. This is very Rahuvian of me as well. Like I have a very strong North Node as well. So this might sound a little different from what traditionalists say, but I truly feel like people need to forge their own path in terms of spirituality. You have that baseline, which is when you look at ninth and 12th house, they're both related to spirituality. In the ninth house, you collect all of these concepts, you learn about everything, and then in the 12th house, you let go of every single spiritual concept you've had.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I know in tropical astrology, the 12th house is very much like the hidden, the subconscious, the taboo, and the repressed self. Is it kind of a similar meaning? I would assume the houses are pretty much transferable, right? More or
Yeah,
less.
yeah. So in Jyotish, the 12th house is mostly, it's all of those things. It's the hidden sub, but it's also related to foreign lands. So anything that is away from our immediate consciousness is completely foreign to us, even if it's within us, because the world is simply a reflection of who we are on the inside. We don't really see it that way because we're still operating at a very, conscious level here and now. But if you truly go in deep, everything is just you. There's nothing beyond you or anything like that. That's what the 12th house is. It's sort of that merging of everything in one.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I know when people look towards Vedic astrology, the calculation is done a bit differently with like I believe it's a sidereal type of chart. Is that correct? Because I know
Yes.
people's signs change a bit, and I've talked to some people who use sidereal, which I know is similar-ish. Um, what would you like recommend for someone if they looked at a Vedic chart or went to a Vedic astrologer to get a reading and some of their signs changed? What is your perspective on that? Like, what should they default to? How should they feel about that? Because I think a lot of people, I mean, perhaps this is actually the ego taking charge of people in a funny way, but I think a lot of people get very attached to whether
Hmm.
they started with Vedic or tropical astrology, like their signs, and
Hmm.
then get really thrown off when they're changed. What's your perspective on that?
You're actually so right because I truly do believe, even as an astrologer, that none of these things should be, tools that you attach yourself so strongly to. So your life should not become about just holding on to that one archetype. And that's what I talk about play a lot. I worship the goddess who plays. Her name is Lalita. And so you should be able to embody all of those 12 zodiac signs, all of those 9 planets, and move past them, because these are just tools to help you. If you attach so strongly to, I am supposed to be this sign, I am supposed to be a certain way, by the way, those things are actually sometimes a self-fulfilling prophecy, because I get a lot of clients and they read all of these negative things about certain placements and they start to feel really bad, and nothing could have happened in their lives, but they start to overthink. Oh, I read this is going to happen in my Mahadasha. I've read really bad things about this. I'm just like, just be here and now. Just be present. You'll be fine. So that's my 2 cents on the whole attachment thing.
Yeah, because I've interacted with a lot of people like that where they'll have specifically some placements, right? Because some placements are known to be more challenging. Like that's especially if you read like astrologers talking to each other, they're like, "Oh God, that's a hard one," or "Oh, that's a great one." I'm Venus and Taurus, and people are always like, "That's a great placement." And then I'll bring up like some of my placements that are not as great, and they'll be like, "Oh, that one's a struggle right there," because I have a huge opposition in the middle of the chart. That's the one people are like, "Oof." But I mean, perhaps we're so I don't know. I think people kind of seek validation in certain placements being called good, and then if they're like, oh well, like my big opposition in my chart, right? Astrologers
Mhm.
tend to look at that and go, that's very challenging. Like if I were to just go, well, I have a huge giant opposition in my chart, right? Woe is me because of this difficult
Yeah.
my chart. I guess that in and of itself is pretty toxic.
Mhm.
Because you've got the natal chart, you've got, I mean, it doesn't suddenly change once you understand what signs you have. And I think a lot of people really, they get very attached to like people's opinions on the placement they have, which is ironically like totally not a
Yeah, that's why
spiritually.
you see so many people sort of fighting on the internet constantly. um, Please continue.
No, yeah. I mean, I just think it's toxic. That was pretty much the end of my thought.
Yeah. I
So
just have one thing to say before we continue on the same lines. So there's this verse that there's this whole stotram, which is like a bunch of verses together and they form a hymn. But there's this particular verse that you begin this stotram with, which really helps you gain some perspective on these things. So it's in Sanskrit. It says Ganesha Graha Nakshatra Yogini Rashi Rupini Devi Mantramayi Naumi Matrika Pitha Rupini. This is something I taught to a couple of my students in this Matrika class I was teaching. So Ganesha literally means someone who rules over groups. So the group could be, your bones, your muscle groups, whatever. It could be all groups. So Ganesha is one of the most important deities. We invoke him first. Graha Nakshatra, Graha means, your planets. Nakshatra are the stars that we use in astrology. Yoginis, some say there's 64 crore yoginis. They're basically supernatural powers. Rashi Rupinim, which means the 12 zodiac signs. So the goddess is actually all of those things. Whether you have like a debilitated Saturn, whether you have an exalted Venus, whatever it is, it's still Devi. And so that really should detach you from this idea of I am this sign and so I behave this way and I can't change that.
yeah, I really like that perspective because I think it reaffirms that it is all part of the same divine, and it all connects, which is something I think we do forget. I think it's a human mental tendency to compartmentalize that we just have as people. Like we really like putting things in boxes, we like separating things, and when things get too interconnected and abstract, I think our brains just kind of struggle to comprehend it just because of like human psychology. And I think that's a good reminder for people for sure.
Yeah, I mean, look at the 12th house of you know the chart. You will notice how it can be loss can be such a difficult thing when you lose your ego, when you have some kind of death within the ego where you let go of this thing. It can be so difficult. It's a release, but it's so beautiful at the same time because then you don't have you can do, you're free to do whatever you want. And so being on the spiritual path in general is like this constant losing of that ego. And that's why 12th house, people usually, demonize the 12th house a lot, but it's such a beautiful house. I could talk about it forever.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard so much fear around the 12th house. I mean, I know like people really are scared of it, and I love the way you're talking about it because it's the most positive and reflective way of thinking about it. Because if you look at it from one lens, yeah, it is like a challenging house, but if you look at it through another lens, it is the challenge that seems to transform us and make us break out of like the constructs we're stuck in.
Correct. And so that's the case with like even positive houses. Like if you have too much of a benefic energy in your life, that's also an imbalance, right? Like I said, Jupiter is about intellect and it's such a big planet. It's so larger than than your life, all of those things. But if a Jupiter is placed a certain way and a certain time comes in your life where you're supposed to be humble and calm and relaxed, and you're stuck in that energy of Jupiter being super egotistical, it's not going to help you or serve you in some way. So having like a good balance in your chart of negative and positive planets should help, and eventually you come to that balance with regular spiritual practice is what I believe.
No, I love that because one of the things that I feel very strongly about is that your natal chart is almost like a map to. There's this really antiquated form of science that is not scientifically correct, but I really like it as a way to explain metaphysics called the humors. And basically, what it is it was an old idea that we had like different four humors within us, and medically, to be healthy, you have to balance out the humors. You don't want an excess or a minimum of any of them. While this is not medically correct, please don't start
Oh no, so
believing
we
in
have
real humor.
something similar in Ayurveda. It's called the doshas. So like sanguine, the phlegmatic is are those the humors that you're talking about?
Yeah, I'm talking about that. The reason why I just said be careful with it is because some of the treatments for humors were back in the day were a little questionable, but I really think this is a great metaphysical idea. Because I see the natal chart as kind of like humors, right? That you're trying to balance
Mhm.
out so that you're not in excess or detriment of any of it.
Yeah, and I feel like the excess and detriment also happens based on the kind of karma that you're supposed to release in this life. So, um, which is why having empathy for people in general who go through really tough times, it's very easy for a lot of spiritualists to say, oh, just detach and it's going to be fine. But to have that empathy and like love for humanity really opens you up to an experience of knowing these people going through a particular karma in their life. And so that humor that they have or that dosha that could be in imbalance. And so, which is why I do this work specifically so I can help people. And that's the only goal. There's no, and it's for the love of Jyotish. That's all.
I think that's really beautiful. Yeah, I mean, I think it's with a lot of spiritual things, it's easier said than done, right? Like it's much easier to say like detached than to actually do it because I think often people hear about these principles and they're like, okay, I'm going to do that. And then of course it's a challenge because these things are not easy to do. If they were easy to do, everyone will have done it already. And so I think often like, it's easier said than done. And I think we should understand and like let people know like if you are struggling with some of these techniques. I mean, I know a lot of people who struggle with even like basic metaphysical techniques because this stuff is
Mhm.
hard and it has to
Yeah.
do with deep parts of your consciousness. And I mean, everyone has challenges with it. Like even the people who like you think are like super enlightened or whatever, like this stuff's a difficult journey because I mean, first of all, nothing worth anything is comes easy. But second, it's about yourself and the gods, and that's just it's hard for everyone, and that's part of why it's so worth it once you start making progress.
Yeah, and I also feel like this detachment stuff, it comes after you've gone through that particular situation yourself. You fully absorbed and digested that teaching. I talk about digestion a lot because Ayurveda is one of my favorite parts of life where digestion is everything. So once you've digested a particular kind of knowledge and experience, that's when you're able to look at it from an objective perspective and be detached from it. And
Yeah,
that's,
that makes a lot of sense.
yeah. And so when I go through like silly little problems sometimes, my mom is just surprised at my ability to be very calm. And it's just a funny conversation we had yesterday. She's just like, sometimes you don't have to be this calm. You need to be a little agitated.
Man, we can trade. Let's trade on that trait. I can get a little irritated. So I wish I need to get to your level there. But one idea about Vedic astrology that I've seen people discuss online and on Twitter and on websites is the idea, and I'm gonna mispronounce this. I'm so sorry.
Mhm.
Nakshatras. I don't know if I got that right.
Nakshatra.
Okay, yeah. What are the nakshatras?
The nakshatras are basically these 27, 28, depending on the tradition. So they're celestial bodies. They're basically known as the bones of the zodiac. And so each zodiac sign has three nakshatras allotted to them. So you have, starting from Ashwini to Revati, Ashwini in Aries and then Revati in Pisces. And so these nakshatras are actually known as lunar mansions. So the moon is known to be very lustful in nature. And the creator god, Daksha Prajapati, he has these 27 daughters that he marries off to the moon. And so the moon spends time in each of these little goddesses. So the nakshatras are actually goddesses. They control the moon. And so each nakshatra, so the moon spends time under each nakshatra, and that's the kind of result you get in your life when you know what your nakshatra is. And so, yeah, so in tropical astrology, you see the sun is very important, right? Having knowing your sun is the ego. But in Vedic astrology, the moon becomes very important. To know your mind is to know everything, because your mind is not separate from the body. Your entire body, your primordial soup, is just that mind. And so when you understand your moon, your nakshatra, you will know why you're here, what sparked your birth into this life.
That makes a lot of sense because you do see occasionally lunar mansions brought up in like very specific discussions of certain astrological stuff. Like I know I read this Arabic astrological grimoire for a bit that went into it, and I learned like a version of them, but they're definitely not given the same level of importance. I mean, I think a lot of Western astrologers don't really know them well. But I see when I look at Vedic discussions, like a lot of Nakshatras brought up. So it does seem to take on a much higher level of importance.
Yeah. Nakshatras are very important also. Like I said, they're the bones of the zodiac sign. So you need like a structure. If you want to go deeper into what your particular planet and why it acts. So a lot of people can have the same generational planet. For example, if you have Rahu in Cancer or Rahu in Capricorn or something like that, but the nakshatras might differ. So that inclination changes, and there's like these so we focus a lot on degrees as well. The degrees define, certain kinds of maturity of the planets and how much
That
karma
makes
they've
sense.
finished in the past life. In this life, what are they here to do?
So in degrees in Vedic astrology, is it like just about like the karmas? Because I know in Western astrology you see degrees have their own kind of like meaning to them. Like what? How do the degrees function in Vedic astrology?
So there's this very beautiful scheme known as the Karaka scheme. Karaka, which means significator. So each planet has been given a particular significator in your life. For example, Atma Karka is the most important. Atma Karka basically means your soul's significator. This is the planet that's at the highest degree in your chart. And for most people, the natural Atma Karka is the sun, because the sun is always omnipresent and all of those things. And so, for many people who have a planet, and so certain planets do really well at higher degrees. For example, Saturn, he's an old planet, so he's mature at a higher degree. But if you look at planets like Mercury, they feel a little. So, when Mercury becomes Atma Karka, it can feel like. So, Mercury is very childish in nature. Now, you put a child onto the seat of the king, you're bound to make some mistakes there. So that's how the degrees differ. So there's Atma Karka, there's Amatya Karka, which means your soul's helper. For example, if your Atma Karka and your Amatya Karka are inimical planets, there's always going to be like a battle in your mind. Or should I do this? Should I do that? It's always like that. And then there's Dara Karka, which is the planet at the lowest degree. Yeah, so I was talking about Darakarka, which means the planet that is at the lowest degree in the chart. And that is supposed to signify your spouse. That's the energy you want in your life, or rather, the energy you need, because it's present at such a low degree. And so you can figure out. So that's how the degrees differ a little bit in Jyotish. And then we also have this concept of, avastha. So some planets are shy, some planets are known to be sleeping, some planets are dancing. It's so beautiful when you think about it.
I love that. And that's actually I like that way of thinking about the degrees because it makes you intuitively understand them. Because I feel like in tropical astrology, people often like memorize meanings of all the degrees. And if you think of it that way, I don't know, it makes a bit more sense, right? Because I feel like if you're not thinking about it in that way, it's a bit more of an uphill battle to like understand them. So I really, really like that idea of looking at it. So one more question that I did have for you is if someone was interested in looking more into these topics, what are like important source text, important things to read, important things to look at? Like, what are the vital things to look towards?
That's a very good question. So I have a lot of book compilations I've created over like the course of 3 or 4 years, just as open resources for people to go look into these PDFs. So there's a beginner's Vedic astrology compilation that I've made. It's just like a Google Drive with like a bunch of books that you can look into. I don't really believe in studying astrology from YouTube resources, mainly because I find some of them to be a little misleading. And also, with books, you get to form your own perception, and it's just juicy because your imagination is being, fed in a lot of ways. So you get to make your own inferences. So I have a Vedic astrology compilation. If anybody needs it, they can just approach me. One of the most important resources is Brihat Parashara Hora Shastra. BPHS is what you know. And then Barbara Pigeon is this wonderful Vedic astrologer who has like a website that is just full of gems. She is so brilliant. I love her to death. I feel like all modern astrologers sort of just love her so much because she has a wonderful website that's like just like a treasure of Jyotish.
That's beautiful. I love that. Thank you so much for leaving those recommendations. And my absolute final question for you is, what advice would you give to people who are interested in this type of stuff?
I think one is to be completely fearless and not let that fear sort of affect you, and also having your putting your entire faith in divine. That's all. Like everything is the goddess, so there's nothing to fear in this world. And also doing your spiritual practice, sadhana is what we call. So do your sadhana. Just don't be so fearful about the things in life, and be more playful. That's all. We're here to play and not, get bogged down by these concepts that we want to hold on so strongly. So yeah, that's all I have to say.
I love that. I think that is just a great message. And I think having a bit of trust is so valuable. And I think that's something that a lot of people should really take to heart. And I think their spiritual journeys would really, really improve. So, where can people find you? Where's your corner of the internet? Where do you reside?
So I'm on Twitter at Shreem Astrology. So my name is the same everywhere. Twitter, Instagram. I have a website, www.shreemastrology.com. And yeah, I just teach a lot of these mantra courses. So if anybody's interested in that, they could just approach me.
I love that. Perfect. I will put all of her links in the description of YouTube or the show notes on podcasting platforms, depending on where you listen to this, so you can check all of her work out. I've been your host, Georgina Rose. You can find me under Dot Darling on every platform under the sun. And this podcast is supported through Patreon. You get a pre-show, which is a little mini episode I record solo before my guests arrive. You get a bonus episode 8 times a year and early access to everything if you join the Patreon. So that's really cool stuff over there. This has been the show. Please like, comment, subscribe if you're on YouTube, and leave a review if you are on a podcasting platform. And I will see you all in the next one. Have a great day, afternoon, mid morning, mid evening, whatever time, wherever it is, wherever you are. Bye.